All right, so we are going to look at Asia and their settlement. Okay, so modern humans first settled the Asia area 75,000 years ago. The earlier humans likely settled hundreds of thousand years before that, even. We aren't going to touch much on it in this particular class, but in our what we consider history, we focus on what is modern humans, or like the ones that kind of have behavioral characteristics that are most similar to what we are now. The first major civilization in South Asia was in the Indus Valley. The Indus Valley is located in Pakistan, Afghanistan, and northwest India. Um, these people relied on the monsoons to provide water for cooking, cleaning, bathing, all kinds of things, just like they do even now. But the really cool thing is that even though it was 75,000 years ago, this civilization developed urban planning, and they had what's considered brick houses. They even developed trade networks that spanned as far as Central Asia, Southwest Asia, and even Egypt, which means that they went miles and miles and miles and miles and miles. These civilizations, this first civilization had nearly 5 million people. There's a reason why this particular area is still very, very populated. It's always been very, very populated. By 1800 BC, the weakened monsoon rains and drought began to devastate the population. The population began to drop. In 1500 BC, the Aryans, which are from Iran, invaded northern invaded northern India. These people spoke the Indo-Iranian language, which is when they kind of brought this new language into the area. They also brought Sanskrit culture as well as ideas of social order to South Asia. This is also when Hinduism and the caste system emerged. So this wave of Aryans really changed the way that the area developed, not just physically and politically, but also in terms of their culture, their language, their religion. The Maurya Empire then came after that, and it stretched across the Himalayas and Karaka. They went to South Asia around 250 BC. This particular empire was very, very prosperous, and it expanded trade, agriculture, and economy. They even created a single and efficient system for financing, administration, and security. So they really began to look like more contemporary governmental structures. They even created hospitals and schools, and they renovated the road systems to make travel easier. And then the next wave of invasions in the area was the Islam Empire. It entered the area in the Middle Ages, but by the 1700s it began to decline. So as you will learn throughout this, Islam is one of the main religions in this area. They had a huge influence in this. This was during the Ottoman Empire. They had a huge influence on not only Southern Asia, but also the Middle East and parts of Europe. So the most recent wave of invasions was British colonialism. Basically what happened was that Britain wanted to expand their empire because they needed more natural resources to kind of fuel this industrial revolution. As you learned in the EU, the Industrial Revolution really spurred Britain into becoming a world power. It helped them become more advanced in technology. They had better tools and equipment and that kind of stuff. So they were looking for ways to expand their empire, to make them bigger, make them stronger, to essentially be the top of the world. They were kind of neck and neck with France a lot at this time, and I know we talked about this a little bit in Europe, but just to refresh, at this time, the more people that you had in your empire, the more land that you had meant the more power that you had. And so most of Europe was trying to go out and conquer all these areas of the world so that they could be on the top. So anyway, By the early 1800s, the British East India Company took over large parts of India, and they had began to conquer India. They established tea and cotton plantations, and they took control of South Asia's resources. Um, the area had already had successful trading systems, as we mentioned a little bit before, but Britain didn't really like the competition, and so they shifted the local industry to raw materials rather than import and export for these individual areas. So Nepal and Bhutan were kind of like buffer states between Britain and China, which makes sense because they're along that Himalayan border. And we're going to learn about in physical geography is that border isolates southern Asia from the northern and eastern parts of Asia because they're very, very difficult to cross. Even now they're difficult to cross. So they were definitely difficult to cross before we had modern transportation. Which means that Britain never went past those Himalayas. They didn't conquer, China, etc. So anyway, Nepal and Bhutan were buffer states between Britain and China, which allowed them to develop these unique cultural features that have very little influence from the outside groups. Again, because of these Himalayas, and they're so hard, mountains are so hard to, navigate and to get across. These particular countries, it was difficult to invade them, it was difficult to control them, it was difficult to colonize them. So they kind of have their own unique culture. But they also have less economic and industrial development because even though colonialism, as you'll learn later on, is not necessarily a positive influence in these countries that they came to, in some ways they were able to kind of push, especially Britain in Southern Asia, they were able to kind of push these industrial movements to help them kind of advance technologically. And so places like Bhutan and Nepal, they never really were able to get better in terms of industrial development. But they also have less economic development because they're so difficult to get to. But because they're difficult to get to, it also means that they're difficult to get out of, and so trade is limited. These two countries remain isolated to this day. Political uncertainty has even limited the economic growth in Nepal further, but the poverty rate has decreased significantly in the last several years. In fact, it's one of those things that like Nepal could probably up their economic income in their country by encouraging tourism because Mount Everest is located in Nepal. The problem is that Nepal is very, very ecologically friendly, and they are very environmentally friendly, and they are very, very worried about these tourists coming in and leaving trash or pollution on their way to Mount Everest. So Britain controlled the area from 1857 until 1947. And then there was a partition in 1947 of Hinduism and Islam. The Hinduism would become what is now India, and Islam would become West and East Pakistan. This in turn prompted large-scale migration of Hindus and Muslims to either side, and it ended up creating a very, very violent civil war. This is in the Kashmir and Punjab area, and they are still in conflict to this day. Basically, they're having trouble identifying what borders belong to who because they've been set by these different religions. But the problem is that there are Islam still located in that part of India, and there's Hindus that are located in that part of Pakistan, and it's much like the Northern Ireland conflict in the early 90s, where everybody's like, well, it's mine, no, it's mine, no, it's mine, no, it's mine, and it's all based in this religious conflict. But it is really, really hard to separate. So in the 1950s, Chia built a road through the northern part of Pakistan, and Pakistan gave them territory in response. And then East Pakistan gained independence and became Bangladesh in 1971. And this helped a little bit with the conflict because they were able to become their own country. The interesting thing also is that only about 30% of people in South Asia live in cities. Most practice agriculture because they are still, a lot of countries in this area are still developing. They haven't made it into fully developed status. But at the same time, urbanization has brought new jobs to cities, which has created migration into these cities. So every year, more and more people are becoming more urbanized. These countries are becoming less agricultural based, which has a lot of mixed things occurring. You know, when there's more urbanized areas in countries, it tends to mean that they're going to reach developed status quicker. But at the same time, if there's nobody to work the agriculture, you know, how are they going to do exports, imports? How are they going to feed their population? British colonialism brought English into the country because obviously they colonized these areas, which means that they basically conquered them, they ruled them, they're in control of them. So English was the national language for this area, which meant that they marginalized a lot of the indigenous languages, which means that they are beginning to get lost. Which of course impacts culture because language is a huge part of culture and it was what separates different areas from each other. Alright, so East Asia. East Asia and Southeast Asia begins in China. It's where modern humans in the region, they were there as many as 80,000 years ago, which is really interesting because if you look at South Asia, you know, humans were there 75,000 years ago, which means they kind of arrived around the same time. But because those Himalayans are there, you know, the chances of them crossing for each other is very, very slim. They had to have gone around or found other ways to go there, or it would have taken many, many thousands of years to basically move through those mountains. So 10,000 years ago, there were several cultural groups that emerged in China. These different groups focused on farming, they had domestication of plant animals, and then they even created pottery. I know it's one of those things that Americans are often learn about in terms of China is their pottery because it was very, very special and unique. So early humans migrated to the coasts of East and Southeast Asia, and then from China and then to East Asia, Southeast Asia, around 50,000 years ago. This is when there was an ice age at this point, and those with seafaring knowledge kind of went to Japan, Australia, etc. So there's this migration. So they all managed to were in East Asia and around 80,000 years ago, and then there began to be a migration of people down to Southeast Asia, across to Japan, and then down into the Oceania, and that was 50,000 years ago. So we're going to look a little bit at China. So Chinese dynasties dominated the political landscape of the area. These dynasties established trade routes, strong military presence. They have forged connections with Korea and Japan. So they began to really become a power in this region. China became a unified state under the Han Dynasty. That was in 206 BC to around 220 AD. So there's about 500 years, 450 years where this dynasty controlled the area. This was considered the golden age of China. Confucianism began in this era, which focused on the importance of relationships within the family and society. And they also looked at human goodness and self-reflection, and they put a really big emphasis on education. And so they began to look less on survival and more on spiritual and intellectual development, which is always important, and it starts to show a change in civilization. Again, due to physical barriers such as the mountains and the Gobi Desert, China could only be invaded in the northeast. Because of this, they built what's considered the Great Wall of China. China basically wanted to be left alone. They were doing really well. They had a really good thing going on. They were really happy. Their people were doing really well, and they didn't want anybody to mess with them. And so people couldn't invade them through the Gobi Desert. They couldn't invade them through the Himalaya mountains. And so the only place really that they could be invaded, like I said, was the north east, which is where they have that wall. And they had the ocean on the other side. The last dynasty that they had in China was the Qing dynasty, and it was from 1644 to 1911. This is important because during this dynasty, they claimed China, Mongolia, Southeast Asia, and Korea. It also was at 1911 is when they had the war for communism. So colonialism in China and Southeast and Eastern Asia is not just Britain. There are a couple different European nations that participated in this. So China had been industrialized for centuries. This means that they were industrialized long before Rome or Greece or Britain. And so they were not easily conquered. You know, they were one of the most advanced civilizations in the world before anybody else. They had clean drinking water, they had transportation, they even had technology. So Britain then came to China to export opium and to break down the culture. Basically what happened at this time is that Britain came in, they said, hey, I need that opium, I need to transport it, I need to sell it for, medical reasons or whatever, and it began to break down the culture of what is considered China. This also instigated social problems, because when they started harvesting this opium and selling it and stuff, it got other people, the Chinese began to get develop drug addictions and all kinds of other things. This resulted in what's considered the Opium Wars, which was in 1839 to 1842. It allowed Britain to gain a foothold and then take most of what's considered central China. Because if they're fighting over drugs and they have drugs, it's a lot easier to conquer them. This was for sure done on purpose by Britain. They instigated this social conflict. They instigated this drug issue to make it easier for them to conquer China, which is really sad if you think about it. Let's see. Portugal then got Macau. Germany ended up with the North China Plain. France ended up with southern China and Southeast Asia. Russia ended up with northern sections of China, and then Japan ended up with Korea and Taiwan. So basically, Chinese culture flourished for 4,000 years. And it was eroded from outsiders. People came in, and these countries came in, and they completely devastated their culture, took everything away of what it meant to be Chinese. The EU colonialism slowed after 1911, and so Japan then took over because, they didn't have to travel so far. It was hard to keep colonialism, the EU presence in China, because it was so far for them to travel. It took so long to get there. They had to go all the way around Africa, or they had to travel straight through most of Asia to get to them. When this began to have this conflict with this transition from the EU to Japan was when the nationalists and communists began to fight for control in China. The nationalists defeated the communists and established a national government in 1925. At this point, the EU was completely evicted. They were not allowed into the area. But then Japan, communism, and nationalism began to fight a three-way war after that, not too long after that. And China eventually united to fight the Japanese, and eventually they won, pushed Japan out, which gave China control of their own country once again. And the Communist Party then won in 1949, which, as you know, is still in place today. I'm not going to go too deep into the communism in China and what that means and how it has evolved and how it has changed and what all these difficulties have arrived, because you're focus on that in later courses. All right. So Southeast Asia. So Southeast Asia is along the coasts of Asia, southern of China, so it's places like Thailand, and places like Japan is considered, even though it's actually Eastern Asia, but it's still part of it. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. Anyway, so there were trade links that were brought Hinduism and Buddhism together and helped spread Islam across Southeast Asia. This was from Sufi missionaries. So most of Southeast Asia is Muslim because of these missionaries. This area also had suffered from colonialization, and we still see those effects today. So Europe became interested in Southeast Asia in the 1500s. At this point, they began to establish permanent colonies. Spain took the Philippines, the Netherlands had the Dutch East Indies, which you should be familiar with because we had the Dutch West Indies in, North America, and you learn about it when we learn about our history. And it's the same idea, but it's on the other side. France had what was then considered Indochina, and Britain had Burma and Malaysia. By the 1800s, only Thailand was independent. Every other area or region of that area had been colonized by a European nation, which means, as you know, from China and from India, the culture in these areas were vastly impacted by their European control. It impacted their economics, it impacted their political structure, their social structure. Pretty much every aspect of these countries was impacted. So Japan, I'll talk a little bit about Japan. The Japanese Emperor Meiji in 1868 sought to kind of increase Japan's modernization and industrialization, so he began to study the world. So just like Europe came into this area to colonize, Japan began to have colonization dreams. So Japan moved south to increase Japan's modernization and industrialization. They looked at education, and they were very good about educating their populace because it was very critical for their advancement in technology. They wanted to surpass their European counterparts. They wanted to be better than them. They did not want to be conquered by Britain. They believed that Britain was so big and it was such a huge world power because of their resource control, which is definitely part of it. They weren't wrong. So by World War II, Japan had colonized much of East and Southeast Asia. They'd taken what was left from European nations, and they even took over parts of what had been colonized by Europe. So they colonized Northeast China, Korea, Taiwan, the French Indochina, the Philippines, and Indonesia. By the end of World War II, Japan had brought westernization and rapid economic growth into the area, and they began to really grow and become their own superpower. They had a new constitution that was developed. They created democracy, and now they are the fourth largest GDP in the world. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about communism. We're going to backtrack just a little bit, kind of focus on this. We're not going to go too deep into it because, like I said before, you'll focus more on this in later classes. So, by the end of World War II, much of the region was considered communist. This means that basically their social, political, and economic systems sought to communal ownership of the means of production, which sounds great in theory, but oftentimes doesn't actually work out like we plan in practice. So typically their societies are factories that are owned by the wealthy few who pay workers lower wages. So communism is a classless society where everyone shares the ownership and thus receives equal parts. So that's where communism is thought to be a good thing, right? Because if everybody owns everything and everybody's equal, then that means there's no poverty. There's no, people have equal access to medical care, they have equal access to education, etc., etc. The problem is that human nature comes in, and it's not always easy to implement. So there was a civil war in 1949 that we mentioned a little bit before in China, where Mao Zedong established the People's Republic of China. That was the communist nation. Basically, he sought to transform China's culture by creating communism at its center. The Great Leap Forward was a huge impact of communism in the area. That was from 1958 to 1961. At this time, they sought to create an industrial power. They wanted to be a world power just like Great Britain and Japan. This in turn didn't work very well though, because it led to widespread famine and deaths of tens of millions of Chinese. China wasn't really ready for this. They were so, a lot of agricultural based, they were still suffering from being colonized by Europe and Japan, and it didn't work very well. But after the Great Leap Forward, they tried to eliminate all remaining traditional elements of Chinese culture. So they took about everything that was part of what had made them great before and they changed it. At this point, they had millions in prisons. They had thousands and millions of people that were forced to relocate or tortured, or cultural sites were destroyed, etc., etc. It was a really sad, hard time in Chinese history. But as China has progressed through the years, they've gotten it under their belt and they've gotten their legs beneath them. And now, even though there is a lot of inequality still in China because of they're so big and so many areas are isolated, it does work fairly well in terms of their economic growth, and they're now one of the world's powers. And for the most part, their people do okay. All right, so Korea also became communist. This was because Russia was communist. As you'll learn later, they became communists and they took over Korea. And they controlled the north part of Korean island, and then the U.S. occupied the southern part because this time the United States was it was during the Cold War, the United States was trying to limit the progression of communism, so they took over Korea so that Russia couldn't go any farther. And that's how we have North and South Korea. Vietnam defeated the French and gained independence in 1954, where they established a government they established a government in the north. Sorry about that. My kid came running in really excited. And so basically the north was communist and the south was anti-communist and Catholic. The United States feared that the north would conquer the south and become communist. And this was when the Vietnam War basically occurred. It was the United States fighting with the South Vietnam against Northern Vietnam, and to basically avoid the communism. However, due to rainforest, heavy artillery couldn't be used, and so the United States lost. They lost. Loads of people died, both on the United States side as well as the Vietnamese, and it was a really hard war, and it was a really sad war. So in 1975, Vietnam united completely under communist rule. They were all, because of the war, the people were exposed to Agent Orange, which caused all kinds of health problems, disabilities, and devastating effects on the ecosystem. They are still trying to recover to this day. We talk about the Vietnam War here and how devastating it was for us because we lost all those people and our soldiers and everything, but it had even more devastating results for actual Vietnam. And not just because of communism, it was because of the types of weapons that were used. All right, so Cambodia is in this region as well. They resisted westernization and U.S. involvement, so they became communists and they refused help from the United States. They saw what happened to Vietnam. They didn't want that to happen. They wanted to return to an agricultural-based society. They didn't want to be industrialized. So they eliminated schools, they eliminated hospitals, and institutions that basically made the entire society work on a collective, in a collective way. They moved away from the urbanization and made the cities no longer economic and political focus for the country. They wanted wealth to spread throughout the countryside and focus on this agriculture again. This in turn created large prison camps that were set up to fight anti-communism, and more than 1 million people were killed and buried in mass graves. This in turn led to famine and starvation. So Cambodia didn't do very well with their communism either. They tried to switch their entire government, their entire structure of their entire society, and it just didn't end well. Okay, so the Shadow Belt. The Shadow Belt is an area of political instability that's caught between interests of competing states. So basically, this whole area is considered a shadow belt because Western involvement led to industrialization and economic growth. But then depression, occurred, and there was a large desire in the societies to kind of return to their traditional values because industrialization is great, but when it comes in from an outsider, it happens or it occurs at the expense of the local culture, of their traditions, of their history, of what makes them them. All right, so that's South Asia. That's kind of the the settlements and spread of all of that. Hopefully that helps you a little bit today.